Yo guys, what's going on? I'm Tim. This is the Real Sports Talk. You can hit me up on Twitter at CashKelly_TRST. Day 14 of the 30 clubs recap, or video 14, because we're really not doing this in 30 days anymore. It's just whenever we get the chance. For the most part, it's day after day. Go to our channel right now. You can check out a ton of videos, including all the teams we've done so far. Different parts of our interview with Jamal the Dirty Bird Anderson, the former All-Pro running back for the Atlanta Falcons. His thoughts on Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning. He was also on ESPN First Take for a while. His thoughts on Skip Bayless. Overall, what he did in his career. His thoughts on Michael Vick as a teammate, as an overall player. Interesting interview, and there is still more to come throughout this interview. And ultimately, you can get some other coverage of the Daytona 500 from Cody if you missed that, and Akeem obviously does the weekly 10 minutes on the clock show, which he is doing a very good job, and I really appreciate how the work he puts in for that show. So day 14, we are doing the Chicago White Sox. This is a team that last year that went 79 and 83, but made a lot of moves in the offseason that lead you to believe that they are rebuilding. First of all, they allowed Ozzie Guillen to go to the Marlins. I think that essentially Ozzie Guillen had run his course as the White Sox manager, so that's not necessarily a bad move. They brought in Robin Ventura, former, I believe, White Sox and Yankee, as their manager. He is a first-time manager, and a lot of people believe that this is the type of guy that's just brought in for a transitional type deal, because ultimately the White Sox aren't ready to contend, so they're not going to go out and spend big money on a guy who is a good manager or has managed before and they think can take them big places, because it'll end up making him look bad. I don't know if that's the real reasoning behind this managerial hire, but it might have something to do with it, because they also traded away Carlos Quentin. They allowed Mark Burley to walk via free agency, and Mark Burley got overpaid. It didn't really make sense. The Carlos Quentin thing, they traded him away for some decent prospects. I don't think that they got probably the best that they could have for him. And they re-signed John Danks to a fairly big deal this offseason. So they're also looking for a rebound from Adam Dunn. We'll get into all that. I'll get you their record and where I think they're going to go. Well, not necessarily their record, but I can give you an estimation. When we do our divisional previews at the end of this, or actually sometime in mid-March, then we'll be giving you the exact record, how many games we think they're going to be out in the division, everything like that. Let's start at catcher then. You got A.J. Pierzynski, who is one of the longtime catchers with one team. He's been with the Chicago White Sox since 2005, the year that they won the World Series. Last year, in 129 games, he hit .287 with 8 home runs and 48 RBIs. Essentially, the power numbers have gone down, because this was a guy before that you can count on for 13 to 15 home runs. Last 2 years, the amount of games has gone down slightly, and so have the power numbers. They've gone from like 13 or 14 home runs to 8 or 9, which isn't necessarily a great trend. The RBIs have always been right around 50 to 60 RBIs. Earlier in his career, when he was with like the Twins and the Giants, they were around in the 70s a couple years. But for the most part, he's going to give you probably an average around like 270. He did it 300 a couple years ago, but for the most part, he'll probably hit you around 275, 280 with 10 home runs and 55 RBIs. Somewhere in that area is probably what you can expect for A.J. Pierzynski this year. Backing him up at catcher, then you have Tyler Flowers. Last season, in 56 games, he hit .197 with 5 home runs and 16 RBIs. The thing about backup catchers is they get so, a lot of times, especially when you have a guy who's been there and is a solid catcher like Pierzynski, they don't get a ton of exposure, so if they're in a funk, they don't get a lot of at-bats to work out of it. So to look at that .197 might not necessarily be the smartest thing. Overall, he's not a great backup, but I don't think he's as bad as that average is going to show you. Actually, yeah, he hit .197 last year. Over at first base, you have Paul Konerko, another one of the guys who's been here for a very long time. essentially, he's spent his whole career here since 1998. He has been with the Chicago White Sox. Started with the Angels for like half a season, but for the most part, he's been with the White Sox. Konerko last season, after having a huge season in 2010, which was a contract year. 2011, he had another nice season, hit 331 home runs and 105 RBIs, took 77 walks, and even stole a base last season, which, you know, that means nothing. But overall, Paul Konerko has been one of the most consistent first basemen in the league over the past 10 or so years, and for whatever reason, he hasn't necessarily ever gotten the recognition that he has deserved. He's always pretty much, for the most part, stayed healthy and done a nice job for this team, so I don't know why he hasn't gotten that type of recognition, but he is a very, very good first baseman. And eventually, throughout the next couple of seasons, you would assume that the White Sox may look to trade him as they are attempting to rebuild. Over at second base, you have Gordon Beckham, a guy who they had huge expectations for when he came over, and I'll get to the backup at first base in a second, but I'm already talking Gordon Beckham. Gordon Beckham had huge expectations. He was supposed to be this big prospect, and things just have not quite worked out so far. In 3 seasons, he's given you 33 home runs and an average of 249. He's been disappointing, and this was a guy a few years ago when they talked about making some big trades. He wasn't untouchable, and as it turns out, he has not been what they have expected so far. The good news for White Sox fans is he's still only 26. He could just be a late bloomer. A lot of times, though, those late bloomers need a change of scenery, and I'm not saying it has anything to do with him playing in Chicago. Sometimes it just doesn't work out in the first place you're in, and then you go to a new place and something clicks for you for whatever reason. Backing up Paul Konerko at first base, I missed this, is Brent Lillibridge. Last season, Lillibridge hit 220 with 16 home runs, so he gives you some pop, but he's certainly not going to hit you for much of an average. Backing Gordon Beckham up at second base, you have Eduardo Escobar, also the backup over at shortstop. Escobar last year, 9 games at 286, so he's very young and looks to be a piece for the White Sox for quite a while at this point, but overall you can't get much of a gauge on a guy who's played 9 games in his career. The starting shortstop, Alexi Ramirez, has been one of the better shortstops in the game over the past 4 or so seasons, which is how long he's been in the league. He came in at 21 home runs, and since then he's been around the 15 to 18 home run mark. He'll hit around 280 in a good year. Last year his average dropped to 269. They need to get that back up. And the one thing they did last year was he did not steal quite as much. He is good for about 15 stolen bases. He is going to be caught stealing sometimes, but that's kind of the risk you take with the guy who is fast but isn't necessarily a straight base stealer, and I think Alexi Ramirez would fit that description. Starting over at third base, you have Brent Morrell. Last season, in 126 games, Morrell hit 245 with 10 home runs and 41 RBIs. He has potential. I don't think there's any question. He is very young, but he's obviously going to have to get that average up this season if he's going to be a mainstay at third base there for years to come. Osvaldo Martinez will be the backup third baseman. Last year, he was with the last 2 seasons. He was with the Marlins. In 2010, in 14 games, he hit 326, and then last year in 20 games, he hit you 130, which really just only makes my point better. When you play less than like 50 games, it really means nothing to look at someone's stats and try and see what type of player they are, because essentially you haven't gotten enough of a gauge on anyone in that little amount of games to know how good they are. Out in left field, you have Alejandro Deza. Last season, and Deza is a natural center fielder, so he should be a very good fielder out in left field. Last season in 54 games, he showed some bright spots for his team. Hit 329 with 4 home runs, 23 RBIs, stole 12 bases. He was actually one of the guys that came up later last season, probably mid-July, early August, that people did not take notice of how good of a season he had, but his production really led the White Sox to be able to trade away Carlos Quentin because they felt that Deza was ready to have a starting position. He's not exactly a young guy to be coming up early. He spent some time with the Marlins earlier in his career, never really found great success there, but in 2 seasons in minimal exposure with the White Sox, he's done a pretty nice job, hit for a good average, and he's even gave you some pop last year, which he never had a home run in his career before last season. So I think Deza, he's not going to give you what Carlos Quentin did. I think a reasonable thing to expect for him is for an average in the high 280s, low 290s this season, and about 6 or 7 home runs with about 20 steals if he plays a full season, and that's pretty productive. In center field then, Alex Rios. One of these guys that came up with the Blue Jays, had a very bright start to his career. And since then, he's had some nice seasons, but he's just never turned out to be worth that 8-year, $80 million deal that the Blue Jays gave him. And for whatever reason, the White Sox picked him up off waivers and decided, we're not going to give you anyone, we'll just take the whole contract. It really doesn't make any sense to be paying this guy $10 million. He's a nice player, but unfortunately, last season the average dipped to 227. Before that, he had 284, 247. I mean, earlier in his career, he hit 302, 297, 291. He looked like a guy that throughout his career was going to hit close to 300, and he just hasn't been able to maintain that level. And you would have assumed, moving from a park like the Rogers Center, which is a decent hitter's ballpark, as Jose Bautista has shown you, but moving to U.S. Cellular Field, you would have assumed that his numbers would have got better, and that's not what has happened. Average-wise, the power numbers really, I mean, he hasn't done anything better than what he was doing in Toronto. I would expect this year he'll hit about 260 with 18 or 19 home runs. Ultimately, he's had a disappointing career. If he can give you what he gave you in 2010, 284, 21 home runs, 88 RBIs, and 34 stolen bases, that is a really solid season out of this guy. The problem throughout his career has just been overall consistency. And then in right field, you have Diane Visidio, another young guy just coming up with the White Sox last season. He's played 67 total games throughout his career. So again, I'm not going to go through the numbers. In those total 67, he's hit 282, giving you 6 home runs and 19 RBIs. I'm not an expert on every single player, I'll be quite honest with you. He will get some looks, and then Kosuke Fukudome, a guy they brought in who spent his whole career with the Cubs and then got traded, I believe, to the Indians last season. Not necessarily a guy who's come in and lit the world on fire. He had big expectations, but since then, since coming over, he's hit about 260 every year, give you like 10 home runs in Wrigley Field, and there shouldn't be much of a dip because he's still playing in Chicago, so the wind is still blowing out, so he should have nice power numbers. But I mean, other than that, he was an all-star in his first year, but he's never really been someone who's produced at a very high level. He's a 4th outfielder, essentially. That is what he's played at, and that's what he will be for the Chicago White Sox team in 2012. Let's go to their rotation now. John Danks got a big payday this offseason. And Danks last season went 8-12 with a 4.33 ERA, which is not good for what he's done throughout his career. He did throw 2 complete games, but the previous 2 seasons before that really show you that this guy's a solid pitcher, and even the previous 3 seasons, I should say. 2008, 12-9 with a 3.32 ERA. That's a really solid season. Close to 200 innings. Then in 2009, the ERA went up to 3.77, but he had a couple more wins, and he went over 200 innings for the first time in his career. And then in 2010, you saw him go 15-11 with a 3.72 ERA, 32 total games, and 1 complete game shutout with a 122 whip. The numbers went back up last season. Not a good season for him, but overall, John Danks is one of the better young pitchers in the game right now. Jake Peavy at the number 2 spot, a former Cy Young winner who has just been a massive disappointment since being traded away from the San Diego Padres. In 2009, when he spent half the season with the Padres and half the season with the White Sox, he was 9-6 with a 3.45 ERA. They gave up a huge package to get this guy. But since then, he's had trouble staying healthy. He's had an ERA in the high 4s both seasons. He hasn't been able to throw you a lot of innings, which is what's going to happen when you have bad numbers. And ultimately, Jake Peavy has just been a huge disappointment. And he said that he's had some weird injuries, and he believes that they're behind him. But at age 31, I don't see him getting any healthier than he's already been throughout his career. And I don't put a ton of expectations in him. I felt last season was going to be a good year for him, and it did not work out. So I'm not going to hitch my wagon, per se, to expect Jake Peavy to do much. And him being at that number 2 spot is one of the reasons why I don't have big expectations for the White Sox. Gavin Floyd will be your number 3 starter. Last season went 12-13 with a 4.37 ERA. Really, the only nice season he's had throughout his career was 2008 when he went 17-8, had a 3.84 ERA. If he can give you an ERA right around 4, that's solid for what Gavin Floyd's going to do for you. If he could throw you close to 200 innings, which he does most seasons, then that's solid. But when you have a 4.37 ERA, I don't know if I want you throwing close to 200 innings because you're giving up a lot of runs and it's not necessarily productive. He has to step it up this year. Philip Humber, a former top prospect in the Mets organization, figured it out last year. They're 9-9 with a 3.75 ERA, 163 innings. If he can give you similar production, then he is a very solid starter at the number 4 spot. And then you have Chris Sale at the number 5 spot, who last season, in 58 games, and they're moving him from the bullpen to the rotation, but take this for what it's worth. He's been really solid out of the bullpen the last 2 years with a 1.93 ERA in 2010 and a 2.79 ERA in 2011. It doesn't necessarily, for the most part, work out when you see these guys move from the bullpen to the rotation, but they're going to give him a chance this season. And really, this is a season where the White Sox are in a transition mode. There's not really a ton to lose, so I don't necessarily blame them for giving some of these guys chances. One of the guys, well, I'll get to him in a second. I'm going to go through like their top relievers. Will Oman last season, 1-3, 4.22 ERA. This is a guy who had a very successful career early on with the Cubs and with the Braves. He was inconsistent with those teams, but when he was on, he was a very solid lefty. Last season, in his first year with the White Sox, he went 1-3 with a 4.22 ERA, so not a very good first season for him in Chicago. Jesse Crane, a former Minnesota Twin, in his first season there last year, did have a very solid season. Through 67 games, 2.62 ERA. That is a very solid, even at an 8-3 record. So he did a very nice job out of the bullpen for them, and this is one of the better setup men type in the MLB. And then Matt Thornton will be your closer. They traded away Sergio Santos this offseason. I really do not get that. But Matt Thornton's going to get a shot as the closer. Last year, 3 of 7 in save opportunities, but the year before he was 8-10. So coming into spring training, knowing you're the closer, that might help him, and we might see better production out of Matt Thornton this season. Overall, from the White Sox, you're looking at a division where I think everyone feels that the Tigers are by far the best team, but overall, the division is very improved. Think about it. The Twins are going to get Joe Mauer and Justin Morneau back, and it finally looks like Justin Morneau is over the concussion deal. And Francisco Liriano should probably have a better year. The Royals have a very good young lineup. I'm not saying it's going to be great right away, but on paper, this is supposed to be a lineup that in a few years, led by guys like Mike Moustakas, who in a few years, this is going to be a pretty nice lineup. The Indians won 82 games last year, and they're getting a guy in Ubaldo Jimenez for a full season, and he did not even pitch that well last year, so he should probably have a better season than he did last year. Overall, it's a division that's improved. Kenny Williams has a lot of turning around to do with this White Sox team. I see them probably in last place in this division this season. So leave me your thoughts in the comments. I'll catch up with you guys later. One guy I forgot to mention here real quick was Adam Dunn. He had a down year last year. I really do not understand, though, why people have such a negative thought out of him. Adam Dunn is what he is. He's going to strike out a lot, and he's not going to hit for a high average. But Adam Dunn this season, I see as a comeback player of the year award candidate. I think he'll hit 35-plus home runs. Moving to U.S. Cellular Field didn't work out the first year, but for the most part, it's a match made in heaven because the wind blows out, and Adam Dunn is a pure power hitter. Him and Mike Stan probably have the best raw power in the entire MLB. I think Adam Dunn is going to have a huge year and prove his critics wrong this year.